There is a specific kind of silence that begins to inhabit a room long before a relationship actually ends. It isn't the comfortable, companionable quiet of two people reading in the same space. It is a heavy, vigilant silence. You might recognize it as the moment you choose not to say the thing that is on your mind, not because you've forgotten it, but because you have already calculated the cost of saying it and decided you can no longer afford the energy. You find yourself standing in the kitchen, watching the person you love move through the world, and you feel a strange, hollow distance, as if you are observing them through a thick pane of glass. You are present, and they are present, yet the bridge between you has become so fragile that you've stopped trying to cross it. You might have started to feel like a ghost in your own life, or perhaps you've noticed that your partner has become a series of predictable patterns rather than a living, breathing mystery. When people see this happening, they often call it growing apart or losing the spark. Friends might tell you that you've become complacent, or society might suggest that you simply stopped putting in the work. There is a lot of shame attached to this quiet drift. We are told that love is a choice and that if it's fading, it must be because we are failing to choose it. But these labels are often too blunt to capture what is actually happening. This isn't a failure of will or a lack of character. It is something much more subtle and, in many ways, much more human. You aren't quitting, and you aren't lazy. You are experiencing a series of highly sophisticated internal adaptations that were originally designed to keep you safe, but are now, quite accidentally, dismantling the very connection you want to preserve. What we are really talking about are the invisible architectures of self-protection. These are the psychological patterns that quietly erode a relationship over time, functioning like a slow leak in a basement that eventually compromises the entire foundation. We often focus on the big, explosive moments, the arguments, the betrayals, the dramatic exits, but those are rarely what destroy a bond. Relationships usually end in the quiet spaces. They end in the things that aren't said, the small withdrawals, and the way our nervous systems begin to categorize the person we love as a potential source of stress rather than a source of sanctuary. There is a profound depth to these shifts that goes beyond simple communication issues. It is a fundamental rewiring of how we perceive the person standing right in front of us. To understand why this happens, we have to look at how the brain handles long-term intimacy. Our brains are, at their core, prediction machines. We are constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next so we can conserve energy and avoid pain. In the beginning of a relationship, the brain is in a state of high plasticity. Everything is new, and the reward centers are firing constantly. But as time passes, the brain moves into a mode called predictive coding. Instead of truly seeing your partner as they are in the present moment, your brain begins to rely on a model of them. You stop looking at their face and start looking at your memory of their face. You stop listening to their words and start anticipating their point of view. Neuroscience tells us that when a relationship becomes strained, the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats, can become hypersensitized to our partner. We begin to scan them for signs of rejection or disapproval. Because the brain is wired to prioritize survival over happiness, it would rather be right about a perceived threat than be vulnerable and get hurt. This creates a feedback loop where we only see the evidence that confirms our partner is a source of frustration. We stop noticing the small gestures of kindness because the brain has labeled them as noise and prioritized the signal of conflict. This isn't a choice you're making. It's your nervous system trying to protect you from the exhaustion of disappointment. These patterns are almost always rooted in the maps we drew for ourselves a long time ago. For many of us, the way we behave in a relationship today is a direct echo of how we learned to survive our earliest environments. If you grew up in a home where emotions were volatile, you might have developed a quieting strategy, a way of shrinking your own needs to keep the peace. If you grew up where you had to perform to be seen, you might now struggle with an exhausting perfectionism in your partnership. We call these attachment styles, but they are more like survival scripts. When you withdraw, or when you become hypercritical, or when you stop sharing your inner world, you aren't doing it to be difficult. You are doing it because at some point in your life, that behavior was the only thing that kept you safe. Your nervous system is simply running an old program, unaware that the environment has changed. It is important to recognize that neither person in this dynamic is the villain. We tend to want to assign blame, to say that one person is too distant or the other is too demanding. But the reality is that different people are simply wired with different thresholds for intimacy and autonomy. One person's need for space is not better or worse than another person's need for connection. They are just different ways of managing the vulnerability of being known. When a relationship begins to struggle, it is usually because two different survival strategies have collided. It's like two people trying to speak different languages, both getting frustrated that the other doesn't understand, without realizing that the grammar of their inner worlds is fundamentally different. There is a strange paradox in this drift, which is that the more we care about someone, the more dangerous they become to our emotional equilibrium. Because their opinion matters so much, the threat of their disapproval feels existential. This leads to a quiet cost. We begin to censor ourselves to maintain the connection. We stop sharing our small wins, our passing thoughts, or our minor irritations because we don't want to disturb the equilibrium. But the paradox is that by trying to save the relationship from conflict, we end up starving it of intimacy. You cannot be truly connected to someone if you are only showing them the parts of yourself that you think are safe. The quiet destruction is actually the process of you becoming a smaller, more controlled version of yourself until there is eventually nothing left for the other person to actually hold on to. If you find yourself in this place, it doesn't mean you are broken, and it doesn't mean your relationship is a failure. It means you are human, and your heart is trying to navigate the incredibly complex terrain of long-term closeness. The distance you feel is an understandable response to the fear of being seen and the fear of being lost. It makes sense that you would want to protect yourself. It makes sense that you would feel tired. The realization that these patterns are happening isn't a judgment. It's a map. It's an invitation to look at the silence not as an end, but as a symptom of a nervous system that is simply asking for a different kind of safety. There is a profound value in understanding the why behind the drift. Once you see the invisible architecture, you can start to move through it differently. If you felt a sense of recognition in these words, it's because these patterns are universal. They are the quiet, shared struggles of everyone who has ever tried to love another person deeply over a long period of time. You aren't alone in the silence. If this video helped you understand why relationships slowly drift apart and how emotional distance develops, let me know in the comments. I read everyone. Your experience might help someone else feel less alone. Like this video if you connected with this message, and subscribe for more psychology-based videos on relationships, attachment styles, emotional healing, and self-awareness. Subscribe so you don't miss new videos on emotional connection, relationship psychology, and personal growth.